Ever feel like you're working harder but just not getting ahead? Like your paycheck isn't stretching as far as it used to?
Yeah.
You're not alone. The UK economy, well, it's been struggling to say the least.
Right.
And today's deep dive is all about figuring out why. We're going to be digging into Foundations, a new book by Ben Southwood, Samuel Hughes, and Sam Bowman.
Okay.
They argue that the UK's economic woes, they all boil down to this thing they call stagnation.
Interesting.
And they start by throwing out this pretty startling stat. Real wages for your average full-time worker in the UK. Lower today than they were back in 2008.
Wow.
I know, right?
Yeah.
15 years, gone just like that, and we're actually worse off.
Yeah, you've got to wonder what's going on. And it's not just wages. Foundations paints this picture of stagnation everywhere you look.
Right.
Like, take housing, for example.
Right.
The UK and France, pretty similar in terms of population size, right?
Yeah, I'd say so.
But guess what? The UK has a staggering 7 million fewer homes than France. 7 million.
Seriously, 7 million.
Yeah.
That's a lot of houses.
It is, and it gets even more surprising. Let's talk about electricity generation. Per person, you know how much we're generating here in the UK?
How much?
It's closer to countries like Brazil or South Africa than it is to, say, Germany or the US. We're talking developing world levels of electricity generation.
You're kidding. That's wild. I mean, we think of ourselves as this advanced, industrialized nation.
Right.
But when it comes to energy, we're lagging behind.
Yeah.
And it's not like we lack the know-how. We were pioneers in nuclear power. I mean, our first nuclear power plant, that was back in the 50s.
Right, right.
But hold on to your hats, because the last time we actually finished building a new one, 1995. 1995.
Wow.
I know, it's enough to make your head spin. So we've got stagnant wages, a housing shortage, and an energy sector stuck in the dark ages. What gives?
Well, thankfully, Foundations lays out a pretty compelling argument, and it all comes down to this idea of shaky foundations.
I see. So are they saying that the UK's economic problems are because we haven't invested enough in things like housing and infrastructure?
That's part of it, but they take it a step further. They argue that the UK hasn't just lacked investment in these crucial areas, it's actively blocked it.
Blocked it. What do they mean by that?
It's like this. Imagine you're trying to build a house, but instead of solid ground, you're stuck with a foundation of sand.
Okay. Yeah, it's not going to work very well. Exactly. That's kind of what they're saying about the UK. We've made it so difficult to build, whether it's houses, transportation, or energy, that we've essentially sabotaged our own growth.
Okay, so it's not just a lack of investment. It's actively making it difficult to invest in the first place.
Precisely. And they've got some pretty compelling examples to back it up.
Like what? Give me an example.
All right, so let's talk about Heathrow Airport.
Okay.
You'd think with a growing economy, more people wanting to travel, the number of flights taking off and landing at Heathrow would be, going up, right?
Makes sense, yeah.
But guess what? The number of flights has barely budged since the year 2000.
Seriously, why is that?
Because it's incredibly difficult to get a new landing slot at Heathrow. In fact, they're so scarce that they're now worth tens of millions of pounds each.
Wait, you're saying that a single landing slot is worth tens of millions of pounds?
You heard that right. It's like owning a piece of prime real estate, except it's in the sky.
That's insane. So by making it virtually impossible to get new landing slots, we've effectively put a cap on the growth of Heathrow.
And on the UK economy as a whole, they argue, because when you make it harder to build anything, airports, housing, power plants, you stifle growth and innovation across the board.
Right. It's like we're our own worst enemy. So if we're the UK, where do we even go from here?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The authors of Foundations, they draw a fascinating comparison to, of all places, France.
France.
Really?
I know, right? When I think of France, I think, well, baguettes and bureaucracy.
Yeah, the land of 1,000 forms. Exactly. But here's the kicker. According to Foundations, French workers, they're actually more productive than their British counterparts.
Wait, hold on. More productive. But how is that possible? Don't they have like a 35-hour work week and like months of vacation?
That's the stereotype for sure. But the numbers don't lie. So what are they doing right that we're not?
Well, it all comes back to those foundations we were talking about. Remember those areas where the UK is struggling? Housing, infrastructure, energy. France has quietly been making some serious moves.
Okay, so break it down for me. What have they been up to?
Well, for starters, they've taken a much more, shall we say, relaxed approach to housing construction.
Relaxed. You mean they're not as worried about, like, every little planning detail?
Not even close. They've built significantly more homes than the UK, especially in and around their thriving cities.
So they're building more homes, which means...
Lower housing costs, greater mobility, a more dynamic economy.
Makes sense. What about transportation? We all know France has those fancy high-speed trains.
Exactly. Their TGV network puts our rail system to shame. Well, we're stuck on the M25. They're zipping across the country in a matter of hours.
Okay, so France is winning on housing and transportation. But what about energy? Don't they rely heavily on nuclear power? Which, we seem to have a bit of a phobia about here in the UK.
It's true. France has embraced nuclear energy in a way that we haven't. And you know what? It's paying off for them, big time.
How so?
Plentiful electricity at a fraction of the cost we're paying. They're also less reliant on fossil fuels, which means they're ahead of the game on decarbonization.
So while we're grappling with sky-high energy bills and an unreliable grid, they're enjoying the benefits of a stable, low-carbon energy system. I'm starting to sense a theme here.
And that theme is strong foundations equal a strong economy. The authors of Foundations are basically saying, look, if France can do it with all its bureaucratic quirks, then the UK certainly can too. It's a wake-up call for sure.
It is, but it's also a reminder that we're not doomed. We can turn things around, but we need to get serious about fixing those foundations. Speaking of which, let's dive a bit deeper into those individual building blocks of growth, shall we? We've talked about housing, infrastructure, and energy in general terms, but Foundations goes into a lot more detail, starting with investment.
Yes, investment. It's the engine of economic growth. But as we've seen, the UK has a bit of an investment problem. And not just a lack of investment, but a systematic aversion to it, especially when it comes to those crucial areas: homes, infrastructure, energy.
It's like we're allergic to building.
In a way, we are. And the consequences are becoming increasingly clear. Take housing, for example. The book points to our antiquated planning system, which dates all the way back to 1947, as a major culprit behind our housing woes.
1947, that's like the year after the Second World War ended. Surely things have changed a bit since then.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But in reality, the system is still incredibly complex, bureaucratic, and frankly hostile to new development, especially in those high-growth, high-productivity areas where housing is needed most.
Which is why we have these insane housing costs in places like London and the Southeast. It's pricing people out, stifling innovation, and holding the entire country back.
Precisely. And it's not just about affordability either. It's about mobility. Talented individuals, they should be able to move to those areas where they can contribute the most, where they can thrive. But they can't, because they're priced out. They're stuck.
So our current approach to housing is basically a form of self-sabotage.
Essentially, yes. And this brings us to another critical building block: infrastructure. Remember how I mentioned those high-speed trains in France?
Hard to forget.
Right. Well, the UK used to be a world leader in infrastructure. We built the first railways, the London Underground. We were pioneers. But somewhere along the way, we lost our mojo.
Yeah, it seems like every other week there's another story about a delayed rail project, a cost overrun, or, my personal favorite, a protected species of newt holding up construction.
You're not wrong. We've become a nation of endless feasibility studies, risk assessments, and bureaucratic hurdles. Foundations talks about HS2 as a prime example, a project that's already billions of pounds over budget and years behind schedule.
All because of some newts.
Well, it's not just the news, of course, but it's a symptom of a larger problem, our inability to just get things built. We've become so bogged down in process and risk aversion that we've lost sight of the bigger picture.
Which is, we need modern, efficient infrastructure to compete in the global economy.
Exactly. And if we don't get our act together, we're going to fall even further behind.
Okay, so we've covered investment, housing, and infrastructure, three pretty dismal foundations, to say the least. Now let's move on to what might be the most pressing challenge of all: energy.
And to be honest, this is one where I'm a bit torn. On the one hand, I think we all agree that we need to transition away from fossil fuels, right? Climate change is real and we need to do our part. But on the other hand, the way we're going about it here in the UK, it seems, well, kind of messy.
Messy is a good way to put it. Foundations. Doesn't mince words. They call the UK's energy policy a complete and utter mess. And honestly, it's hard to argue with them. We're in this awkward in-between phase, trying to wean ourselves off fossil fuels, but at what cost? We're pouring billions into intermittent renewables like wind and solar.
Which, on the surface, sounds great. Who doesn't love clean energy? But the reality is far more complex. The intermittency issue, the fact that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, means we need a reliable backup. And guess what we're relying on more and more.
Don't tell me. Gas.
Bingo. Which kind of defeats the purpose, doesn't it? And of course, gas is expensive. So we're paying a premium for energy that's not even always there when we need it.
And let's not forget those hidden costs associated with all those renewables, grid balancing, backup power generation, new transmission lines. Those costs don't just disappear, they get passed on to consumers and businesses.
Exactly. And it's not like we don't have other options. The UK was once a leader in nuclear power, but now we seem to have developed a collective aversion to it.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, isn't it? We built the world's first commercial nuclear power plant, but now we're shutting them down left and right.
And we're paying the price for it. Nuclear power is a proven, reliable, and, dare I say, elegant solution to our energy needs.
Elegant.
Well, it's certainly more elegant than covering the countryside in wind turbines or relying on gas to keep the lights on when the wind isn't blowing.
I'll give you that. So what's the takeaway here? Are the authors of Foundations suggesting we go all in on nuclear?
They're not prescriptive in that way. They're simply pointing out that our current approach is unsustainable and that we need to be more open-minded about all our options, including nuclear. But even more important than any one solution is recognizing the interconnectedness of all these challenges.
What do you mean?
Well, it's all connected. The lack of affordable housing makes it difficult to attract and retain talent. Our creaking infrastructure stifles productivity and drives up costs. And our reliance on increasingly expensive and unreliable energy undermines our industrial base. These aren't isolated problems, they're all symptoms of the same underlying issue. We've neglected those essential foundations, and now the whole structure is starting to crumble.
So it's not just about building more houses or slapping up a few wind turbines. It's about taking a step back and saying, okay, what do we want our country to look like in 20 years? And how do we build the foundations to support that vision?
Exactly. We need a long-term plan, a coherent strategy that looks at all these challenges holistically. And the good news is, it can be done. The authors of Foundations, they're actually quite optimistic.
Optimistic. After that rather bleak assessment of the UK's current state.
They are. They believe that the UK can turn things around, but only if we're willing to make some bold changes.
Like what? Give us the good stuff. What needs to happen?
Well, they argue that we need to unleash the power of the private sector.
Okay, so less government bureaucracy, more free market innovation.
In a nutshell, yes.
Yeah.
They say we need to cut through the red tape, streamline the planning process, and make it easier and cheaper to build. Build homes, build infrastructure, build energy systems. Just build, build, build.
It sounds a bit like that old adage, a busy city is a happy city.
There's some truth to that. But it's not just about being busy, it's about being productive.
Yeah.
And for that, you need those solid foundations.
Right, because a city built on sand is only going to crumble no matter how busy it is. But this whole build our way out idea, it's not exactly a new concept, is it?
It's not. In fact, the authors draw a fascinating parallel between the UK today and, believe it or not, the 1930s.
The 1930s, that's what, the Great Depression era? Not exactly a period known for its economic prosperity.
True, but remember what came after the Great Depression. A period of remarkable growth and innovation. And a big part of that was driven by, you guessed it, massive investment in housing and infrastructure.
So they're saying we need like a New Deal for the 21st century?
Something like that. The government back then, they didn't shy away from bold action. They cut through red tape, streamlined the planning process, and unleashed a wave of construction that transformed the country.
And it wasn't just about building for the sake of building, right? Those projects, they had a certain aesthetic, a certain vision. Those garden cities, those Art Deco train stations, they still stand as testaments to that era of ambitious building.
Exactly. They understood that this wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about creating a better future for everyone. They invested in well-designed homes, efficient infrastructure, and yes, even beautiful public spaces. And it worked. The UK emerged from the shadow of the Depression stronger and more prosperous than ever before.
It's a powerful reminder that we've faced similar challenges in the past and we've overcome them. But it took bold leadership, a clear vision, and a willingness to, well, build. So where does that leave us? What's the final thought you want to leave our listeners with today?
I think it's this. The UK has the potential to be a global leader again, but we need to stop being afraid to build. We need to embrace a bolder vision for the future, one that prioritizes those essential foundations, housing, infrastructure, and energy. Because without them, we're just building castles in the sand.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into foundations. It's a thought-provoking read, one that I highly recommend to anyone who cares about the future of the UK. And as we discussed today, that future is ours to build. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning,